The night of the harvest assembly at Wrentham, when the Duke of Ashford crossed a room full of people who were watching him do it, Cecily Hartwell was standing near the wall, with her back very straight, and her hands folded at her waist, precisely as she had been taught to stand in rooms where she did not belong. She had been standing in rooms where she did not belong for the better part of 4 months. She was good at it by then. What she was not prepared for was his face, or the particular quality of his walking, or the fact that he stopped in front of her and said her name the way a man says a name he has been practicing in private. She was not prepared for any of it. She had been prepared for considerably less. It had begun, as most reversals do, with a road she knew and a man who did not believe she knew it. The crossroads outside Wrentham sat where the Brentfield Road split from the old coach road, and in June the hedgerows on both sides had grown tall enough that the signpost at the fork was half swallowed by new growth. Cecily had been on that road, with her father, every fortnight for 3 years. The left fork added 4 miles and crossed a low bridge that flooded in wet weather. The right fork, the narrower one, ran through the old pine wood and came out on the Brentfield lane precisely where it ought to. She had told the other carriage all of this through the window. The man in the other carriage had listened to her with the particular expression of a person who is waiting for someone more qualified to speak. He was dark-haired, broad across the shoulders, and wearing a coat that cost more than her father's annual living. His jaw was set like a man accustomed to receiving information he does not intend to use. When she finished, he thanked her with perfect courtesy. And then he took the left fork. Cecily watched the carriage disappear around the bend and felt, in the region of her chest, the small familiar compression of a thing that had happened before. She did not examine it closely. She took the right fork and arrived at her destination in time for supper. If you are enjoying this story and wish to follow Cecily's journey to its end, a subscription costs nothing and takes a moment. Now, where were we? 3 weeks after the crossroads, a letter arrived at the rectory in Wrentham. It was from Lady Morecambe's secretary, and it offered Cecily the position of paid companion to Lady Morecambe's ward, a girl of 11 named Eliza, at Morecambe Park in Derbyshire. The wage was £32 per annum. Her father's debt stood at £800, accumulated across 9 years of a living that had never quite matched the parish's demands, and worsening each year since his health had declined. Cecily read the letter twice, then put it flat on the table, and then picked it up again. She accepted. By the time she arrived at Morecambe Park in late June, her father had been buried for 11 days. The letter from Lady Morecambe's secretary had not mentioned that the position would begin so quickly. Cecily suspected this was not an oversight. She had 1 trunk, a borrowed shawl she had not yet returned, and a small oval miniature of her parents on their wedding morning that she carried in her coat pocket rather than packing. She pressed it there as the carriage turned through the estate gates, and she saw the park for the first time. A long stone house, iron gray in the afternoon overcast, with windows that reflected the clouds back at themselves, and lawns that fell away to a ha-ha, and then to fields. It was very large. She was very small inside it. Lady Morecambe received her in the east drawing-room, which smelled of beeswax and old roses, and which contained more gilt than Cecily had previously encountered in a single room. Her ladyship was perhaps 60, dressed in deep purple that stopped exactly short of mourning, with rings on 4 fingers and a fan held at a height that communicated, without words, that she was making a concession by holding it there at all. Her eyes were quick and assessing. She looked at Cecily, the way a solicitor looks at a document he suspects has been altered. "Miss Hartwell." She said it precisely as one says the name of a piece of furniture one has ordered from a modest supplier. "You will be quiet, reliable, and present when Eliza requires you. You will not form opinions about the household's management. You will not discuss the Duke's movements with the staff. You will eat in the schoolroom. Yes, my lady, Cecily said. You are a clergyman's daughter. I am. Lady Morecambe's fan moved one precise degree. One hopes the useful parts of that education have survived. Cecily met Eliza that afternoon. The girl was slight and solemn. With dark eyes she kept trained on the floor when addressed, and a habit of pressing her fingertips together at the knuckle when she was thinking. She had been at Morecambe Park for 4 years since her parents died. She spoke in short, careful sentences, and watched Cecily's face for signs of insincerity with a directness that Cecily found, without meaning to, rather reassuring. Do you like music? Eliza asked on the second day. I play tolerably, Cecily said. I read well. I know some French and very little Italian. I cannot draw, but I will not pretend otherwise. Eliza considered this. Miss Price pretended otherwise. Her drawings were dreadful, and she was always cross when I said so. I imagine she was. Are you staying? Cecily thought about the £800. Yes, she said. I am staying. The Duke of Ashford was absent from Morecambe Park through the whole of July and most of August. He was in the north, the housekeeper said, on business related to the estate. Lady Morecambe mentioned him only as one mentions a weather system, with authority and the assumption that his arrival would require preparation. The portrait of him in the long gallery showed a younger man, perhaps 25, in a dark coat, with his hands at his sides and an expression of such careful neutrality that Cecily could not determine whether the painter had been skilled or simply cowardly. She had not yet connected the portrait to the man at the crossroads. On the morning of the 3rd week in August, Eliza failed to appear for breakfast. Cecily found her in the old music room at the far end of the east wing, sitting on the floor with her back against the instrument bench, and her arms crossed over her knees. She had been crying, though she had stopped by the time Cecily reached her, and was now engaged in the very determined project of not appearing to have cried. Eliza, I am perfectly well, Eliza said to her knees. Cecily sat down on the floor. This was not what companions were meant to do in music rooms, but she sat down anyway, with her back against the bench beside the girl, and waited. After a while, Eliza said, very quietly, that Lady Morecambe had told her she would be sent to a school in Bath in November, that there had been talk of it for some time, that she had not been asked. Cecily already knew about the school in Bath. Lady Morecambe had mentioned it to her in the 2nd week as a settled decision, and had asked her, with the smoothness of a woman accustomed to asking for things in ways that did not permit refusal, to prepare a report on Eliza's progress and temperament that would support the case for the girl's early removal. The report, her ladyship had indicated, should emphasize difficulties rather than strengths. It should characterize Eliza as a child requiring more structured intervention than a private companion could provide. Cecily had nodded and said nothing. She wrote the report that week. She wrote what she had observed: that Eliza was quiet and perceptive, and had been made to feel precarious in a house that treated her as a guest rather than as a ward, and that removing her to Bath in November, before she had established any settled affection in her current situation, would cause her a harm she was too disciplined to articulate. She wrote it in a clear, even hand, and she put it on Lady Morecambe's desk without altering a word. Lady Morecambe read it in silence. When she finished, she set it flat on the desk and said, with the cool finality of a woman correcting a servant's arithmetic, "This is not what I asked for." "No, my lady," Cecily said. "It is what I observed." The fan moved. Lady Morecambe looked at her with an expression in which several calculations were made very quickly. "A clergyman's daughter," she said, "with a father's debts and no other prospects, ought to understand the value of a position well held." "I do understand it," Cecily said. She could feel her heart in her throat. She kept her hand still. I understand it precisely." Nothing more was said about the report. Nothing more was said about the school in Bath, at least for the time being. Cecily returned to the schoolroom and taught Eliza 20 new French vocabulary words, and did not permit herself until that night to consider how entirely she had just placed herself at Lady Morecambe's discretion. Samuel Fraser, Duke of Ashford, arrived at Morecambe Park on the 22nd of August in a traveling carriage that came up the drive at a pace that suggested he had driven from the north without stopping longer than the horses required. Cecily saw him from the schoolroom window, a man in a dark coat, swinging down from the carriage in the courtyard below, with the movements of someone who had been sitting still too long and was relieved to be otherwise. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired. He stood in the courtyard for a moment with his hand resting against the carriage door, his face turned toward the park's west fields, and his expression was the same careful neutrality as the portrait in the long gallery. Cecily did not, in that moment, place him at the crossroads. She saw a duke in a courtyard, and she was aware, distantly, of the quality of his stillness, and she turned back to Eliza's declensions. She was introduced to him the following morning in the east drawing-room, with Lady Morecambe present and seated, and 2 footmen doing nothing visible near the door. He was taller than she had realized from the window, and his eyes were a light gray that made his expression harder to read than most. He looked at her with a focused attention that felt impersonal, the look of a man cataloging a new variable in a situation he was already managing. "Miss Hartwell," Lady Morecambe said, with the small particular emphasis that meant, "This is a servant," briefly visible. "Your Grace," Cecily said, and executed a curtsy that she had been doing correctly since she was 12 years old. He said, "Miss Hartwell," and then nothing else for a moment, and in that moment something shifted very slightly in his face. It was as brief as a change in light. He turned to Lady Morecambe, and the conversation moved to estate matters, and Cecily was not addressed again. She might have left the room without thinking more of it, except that as she reached the door, she heard him say, with a quality of quietness that was not intended to carry, "Is she settled well enough?" The girl. Lady Morecambe's answer was smooth and brief. Yes, Eliza was quite settled, quite content. All was well in hand. Cecily stepped into the corridor and stood there for a single breath before walking on. He had asked about Eliza. He had not asked about her. She reminded herself that there was no reason he should. Over the days that followed, she assembled a picture of him in pieces, the way one assembles a picture of anyone in a house where one occupies a particular stratum. At a distance, from the evidence of others, and from the small involuntary data of proximity. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gryce, said he had not been at the park in 7 months. The underbutler said he worked past midnight most evenings. Eliza said, with careful lightness, "He is my guardian. He asks after my lessons in letters. He is very formal in letters. He was formal in person as well, when their paths crossed, which they did several times a week in the ordinary course of a large house. He passed her in the corridor outside the library on a Tuesday and said, 'Good morning,' in the level declarative way of a man for whom politeness is a practice rather than a feeling. She returned the greeting and moved on. On Thursday, he passed her again near the bottom of the east staircase, and he paused briefly and said, 'Eliza appears to be in better spirits.' 'She is,' Cecily said. 'She has been working at her French. She mentioned you did not pretend to draw.' A pause opened between them. 'I don't,' Cecily said. Something moved across his face. 'Nor do I,' he said. He continued up the stairs. It was in the library, on the following Saturday morning, that she first understood his wound, though she did not yet call it that. She had gone early, before Eliza was awake, to find a particular grammar she had left there the day before. The library was long and cold in the early light, and she had not expected him to be in it. He was standing at the far end near the window that faced the north court, and he was not reading. He was holding a book, but his eyes were fixed on the glass, and on the table beside him was a portrait, turned face to wall. The frame was dark wood, and the canvas was of a size that made it significant. Not a miniature, but not a large commission. Perhaps 12 by 14 inches. The kind of portrait made of a person one wished to look at often. He heard her and turned, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He looked at her with an expression in which something private and already controlled was being pressed further down, and she understood that she had arrived 1 minute too late to have not seen it. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said. "I will return later." "There is no need." He set the book down. "I am finished here." He moved toward the door, and she stepped aside. He stopped beside her, not close, but close enough that she could see the line of his jaw in the gray light, and the particular way he did not look at the turned portrait as he passed it. Close enough to see, in the small space below his composure, the shape of something that had been pressing against it for a long time. He said, without looking at her, "My brother's portrait. I find it easier, in the mornings, without it." Cecily did not say anything. She stood very still. "He died 4 years ago," he said, and there was nothing in his voice except the fact. "In Scotland. He took a road into the wrong valley. I had countermanded the guide's advice before they left." He paused. "I had been confident." He left the library. Cecily stood in the morning light for a long time with the turned portrait and the particular grammar and the weight of a thing she had not been prepared to receive. That is perhaps the moment when the story shifts from what was happening to what she began to understand was happening, though she would not have used those words. She was a practical woman. She had a position to maintain and an 11-year-old to educate, and a debt of £800 pressing on her like weather. She was not in the habit of reading meaning into shared silences with dukes. She was, however, very precise in her observations. And what she had observed across 2 weeks was a man who asked after the ward's welfare before the ward was in the room. A man who said "good morning" in corridors without looking at her, and then looked after her once she had passed, which Mrs. Gryce had mentioned without meaning to while explaining the linen inventory. A man who had arrived at a house he had not visited in 7 months, and who, within his first week, had twice found himself in conversation with the companion. She did not think he meant it. That was the wound's work, the neat machinery by which a woman who has been told, in 100 small ways, that she is not the kind of person one means things toward, converts all the evidence into coincidence. Lady Morecambe had been watching all of this with the attention of a woman whose social authority depends on seeing patterns before they fully form. In the 3rd week of August, she introduced Dorothea Vane. Dorothea arrived at the park for what Lady Morecambe called a fortnight's visit, and the household staff, more accurately, called a presentation. She was 22, with a great deal of pale hair arranged in the current fashion, and a manner of moving through a room that suggested she had been told from girlhood that rooms were arranged for her convenience. Lady Morecambe seated Dorothea beside Samuel at every meal. She arranged walks in the shrubbery and drives to the village in configurations that invariably placed the two of them opposite each other. She said to the housekeeper, within Cecily's hearing one morning, "Miss Vane is precisely what this household requires. Well-connected, even-tempered, and entirely sensible." She paused, just long enough. Not a provincial with opinions above her station. Cecily was arranging Eliza's books on the shelf above the fireplace and did not turn around. "She means you," Eliza said later, in a tone that was neither question nor accusation. "She does," Cecily said. "I told her your French pronunciation is better than Miss Vane's." Cecily looked at her. "Did you?" She said it was not a relevant consideration. It wasn't, of course. Cecily knew that. What was relevant was Dorothea's godmother, who was Lady Morecambe, and Dorothea's connections, which were exactly the sort that made marriages efficient and comprehensible to everyone involved. What was relevant was £800 and £32 per annum, and the way a duke's great-aunt could make a companion's position untenable in ways that left no fingerprints. She watched Samuel at dinner that night. He was seated next to Dorothea, and he spoke to her with the same level courtesy he extended to everyone, which told Cecily precisely nothing. He had the social fluency of a man who had been trained from childhood to be equally legible to everyone and revealing to no one. What she noticed, because she was precise in her observations, was that he glanced toward the far end of the table twice during the fish course. She sat at the far end of the table. She did not look back. The estate dinner came on the 1st of September. It was a formal occasion. The local families, the magistrate and his wife, several neighboring landowners, and an assortment of guests Lady Morecambe had been accumulating for the purpose for 3 weeks. Mr. Peel, the solicitor, was present as well, having been at the park for several days already on estate business. The dining room was lit with 40 candles, and the table was extended to its full length, and Cecily, who was present only because Eliza had been permitted to sit with the adults for the first remove and required a companion's presence, wore her best dress, which was a pale green silk 3 seasons old, and retrimmed once along the bodice. She had sat through the first remove and the second without incident, which she had considered the most likely outcome. Eliza had behaved beautifully and eaten almost nothing from nerves, which Cecily had quietly addressed by passing her the bread without drawing attention to it. Then Lady Morecambe rose. It was, in retrospect, a very efficiently constructed ambush. She rose and waited for the table to quiet, which it did with the practiced speed of a group of people accustomed to being addressed by someone whose social authority they were not prepared to question. She spoke for no more than 40 seconds. She said that she wished to share with her gathered friends the happy news that her goddaughter, Miss Dorothea Vane, had accepted the suit of the Duke of Ashford, and that the match would be formalized in the coming weeks by Mr. Peel. The table responded as tables respond to such announcements, a small collective inhalation, then murmurs, then several voices at once offering congratulations. Dorothea looked composed and pleased in the specific way of a person who has been told to look composed and pleased. Samuel, at the head of the table, did not speak. His face was still. That face, that careful carved stillness, told Cecily everything she needed to know about whether he had agreed to this or been presented with it. He did not deny it. The candles burned. Cecily sat very straight in her chair and felt in the region of her chest the small familiar compression, and this time she examined it closely, because it was larger than usual, and she found, to her precise and practical horror, that it was not only familiar, it was also grief. She got through the rest of the evening. Getting through things was a skill she had practiced until it was indistinguishable from composure, and composure was the primary professional requirement of her position, and so she applied it without spectacle. She helped Eliza back to bed, listened to her say her prayers, waited until the girl was asleep, and then returned to her own small room at the end of the east wing and sat on the edge of the bed with the oval miniature of her parents in her hand. Her father would have known what to say. He had been a gentleman and an indebted one, and he had understood, in the specific way of people who have spent their lives slightly outside the frame, that what the world calls settled is often only settled for the people who settled it. He would have said that she had done the work required of her, and that the rest was not hers to manage. She sat with the miniature until the candle burned low, and then she made a decision. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was the only one she could make, and still be the person her father had known. She requested an interview with Lady Morecambe the following morning. Lady Morecambe received her in the east drawing room, as she had on the first day, with the same quality of concession in the angle of her fan. She looked at Cecily with the expression she reserved for things she expected to manage with minimal effort. "My lady," Cecily said, "I am giving my notice. I will remain for 4 weeks, which is the term the position requires, and I will ensure that Eliza is well settled before I go. I wish to tell you myself, and I wish to tell you honestly that I am leaving because I cannot, in good conscience, remain in a household where a child I am responsible for is being managed without her welfare as the primary consideration. Eliza did not choose this house. She did not choose to have no one who asks her what she wants. I cannot correct that from inside it." The fan was very still. "A clergyman's daughter," Lady Morecambe said, and her voice had a quality in it that Cecily recognized as the sound of a woman recalculating. "With £800 of her father's debts, and not another position in England." "Yes," Cecily said. "That is correct." The door behind her was open. In the corridor, footsteps stopped. She did not look back. She learned afterward, from Eliza, who had learned it from Mrs. Gryce, who had learned it from the under-butler, that Samuel had been in the corridor. That evening she went to the schoolroom and began quietly organizing Eliza's books, putting the reference volumes in a logical order and the French grammars together on the second shelf, because whoever came after her would need to find things. And she could not control whether that person would be kind, but she could control whether the books were in order. She was still there when Eliza came and sat in the reading chair and watched her for a while and said, "Are you frightened?" "Yes," Cecily said. "Somewhat." "I am as well," Eliza said. She was quiet for a moment. "Miss Hartwell, will you still be at the Harvest Assembly?" "It is in a fortnight." Cecily counted. The 4 weeks' notice would hold. "Yes," she said. "I will still be there." "Good," said Eliza, and pressed her fingertips together at the knuckle, and said nothing more. And Cecily understood that this was the most reassurance she would be offered, and that it was, in its way, considerable. The Harvest Assembly at Wrentham was held on the 14th of September in the assembly rooms above the inn, which had been built for exactly this occasion, and used for no other, and which smelled of floor wax and autumn and the particular anxious perfume of 24 families who saw each other at this event, and no other, and felt the year's accumulated regard and disregard pressing for expression. Lady Morecambe attended in state, with Dorothea at her side and Mr. Peel somewhere in the room, and with the confidence of a woman who had arranged 3 things in the past fortnight and saw no reason that any of them should not hold. Samuel attended because the Duke of Ashford attended the Harvest Assembly, as the Dukes of Ashford always attended, because this was his county and these were his tenants, and because his great-aunt's confidence was not, in every particular, a thing he shared. Cecily attended because she had told Eliza she would, and Eliza was sitting with the daughter of the local magistrate across the room, pressing her fingertips together at the knuckle and watching the door. If you have found yourself here, in these assembly rooms on a September evening, wondering how 4 months and a crossroads and a turned portrait and a report written honestly could possibly arrive at a resolution, you are not alone. Leave a word in the comments and then stay very close. The ending belongs to Cecily. The dancing began. Cecily stood near the far wall and watched Eliza manage the social terrain of the room with the careful competence of a child who had learned that no one was going to do it for her. Lady Morecambe was across the room, holding court to a cluster of the county families, and Dorothea was beside her. And the two of them formed a composition of satisfied hierarchy that was, Cecily had to acknowledge, quite effective. Samuel stood near the door. She was aware of him without looking at him directly, which was a skill she had developed over the past 3 weeks by necessity. He had a quality of standing still that made the room's motion organize itself around him, rather than past him. He had spoken to 4 people since arriving, all briefly, and to each with the level impersonal courtesy of a man completing requirements. He had not yet danced. He was looking at her. She had been avoiding this knowledge for 20 minutes, and she stopped avoiding it now because she was precise in her observations, and because the evidence had accumulated beyond reasonable doubt. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been trying to resolve in private and has concluded cannot be resolved that way. She held still. Her hands were folded at her waist. Her dress was the pale green silk, 3 seasons old. And she was aware of it the way one is aware of everything that places one accurately in the hierarchy when one would prefer not to be placed. He moved. Not quickly. Not with urgency, but with the particular directness of a man who has made a decision and is now enacting it, which has its own quality of irrevocability. 3 strides across the room became 5, became the whole distance of the floor, became him stopping in front of her, with the candlelight between them and Lady Morecambe across the room, and every family in the county in sudden possession of an excellent view. Dorothea saw first, and went very still, which was the measure of her intelligence. Lady Morecambe saw a half-second later, and something in her expression closed quickly, which was the measure of hers. "Miss Hartwell," Samuel said. He said it the way she had not expected anyone to say her name. He said it the way a man says a name he has been practicing in private. The room was very quiet, not silent. The musicians had not stopped, but the social noise had dropped by several degrees, and several faces had turned. And she was aware of all of it with the precision of someone who has spent 4 months attuned to every change in the quality of a room's attention. "Your Grace," she said. "In June," he said, "at the Brentfield crossroads. You gave me directions." The room's attention sharpened perceptibly. She saw it. She felt it. She kept her face composed. "I remember," she said. "I took the other road." His voice was level, quiet, carrying to exactly the distance of the 2 of them, and no further, except that the room's silence was carrying it further than that. "I traveled 4 miles before the bridge was out, and the road became impassable, and the coachman confirmed the alternative was precisely what you had described." She said nothing. She was waiting, with every calibrated instrument she possessed, for what came next. "You were right," he said. "At the crossroads. And I was aware, within the first fortnight of my return to this house, that you had been right in a number of other particulars as well." He paused. One brief pause, in which something in his face moved without being controlled, back into place. "I should like the opportunity to be correct this time, Miss Hartwell, if you will permit it." The word "permit" carried the whole weight of the Regency machinery in it, which was to say, it carried the £800 and the £32 per annum, and Eliza in the reading chair pressing her fingertips together, and 4 months in rooms where she did not belong, and a father who understood things he could no longer say, and a crossroads in June where she had been told, by the quality of a man's inattention, that her knowledge did not count. It carried all of it, and she heard all of it, and she stood very straight with her hands folded at her waist. "I believe," she said, "that you are capable of it." It was not capitulation. It was a judgment from a woman who had observed him carefully, and he heard it as such. And something in his face opened the way a room opens when the windows are finally let in the light. Across the room, Lady Morecambe's fan had stilled completely. She sat with the expression of a woman who has organized 3 things and is arriving at the recognition that one of them has moved without her permission. It was not a cruel expression to observe, Cecily thought. It was the expression of someone encountering the limits of a system she had been confident was without limits. Dorothea Vane looked at the floor, and then at the door, and then at Lady Morecambe, and then made the sensible decision of a sensible young woman who had been placed in an arrangement she had not chosen any more than anyone else had, and Cecily found, to her own quiet surprise, that she could not hold it against her. Mr. Peel appeared at Samuel's shoulder, as solicitors appear at moments of legal significance, which was to say, with the timing that suggested he had been positioned nearby for a reason. He murmured something brief. Samuel inclined his head in the small acknowledging motion of a man who had discussed this with his solicitor already, and was glad the procedural part was not being left to ceremony. The musicians, reading the room with the instinct of people whose livelihood depends on reading rooms, began a slower piece. 2 or 3 couples moved to the floor. The county's collected attention did not disperse so much as rearrange itself into the quiet, continuing observation of a community that would be discussing this evening for the remainder of the year. Eliza, across the room, had pressed her fingertips so firmly together that her knuckles had gone white, and then she released them, and looked at Cecily with the dark, composed eyes of a child who has been managing uncertainty for a long time, and is deciding, carefully, whether this particular resolution is trustworthy. Cecily held her gaze, and gave the smallest nod. Eliza, after a moment, nodded back. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Peel made the necessary arrangements with the efficiency of a man who has been asked to do a thing that is straightforward and is proceeding without obstacle. The £800 of her father's debt was settled privately, in a manner that Cecily learned of only when Samuel told her directly, which he did in the library, in the morning, with the portrait of his brother once again turned to face the room. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said that she would not pretend to be unmoved by it, and that she would not pretend to be unbeholden to him, and that she intended to be honest about both things for the entirety of their acquaintance. He said, "I would expect no less." She looked at the portrait. The young man in it had his brother's jaw, and a quality about the eyes that was not the careful neutrality of the elder, but rather an openness, something not yet composed into reserve. She thought he had been young. She thought Samuel had been carrying this for 4 years, turning it toward the wall in the mornings. And that was its own kind of long work. "He looks like someone who would have taken the right road," she said. Samuel was quiet for a moment. "He would have," he said. He was considerably better at listening than I was. "You are improving," Cecily said, and he looked at her with the expression she had learned, by then, to recognize as the thing that had been there since August, the thing she had converted into coincidence for as long as she could manage. By the close of September, the house had settled into a new arrangement. Lady Morecambe remained because this was, after all, her nephew's house, and she was a woman of practical intelligence who had recognized in the assembly rooms that the field had changed, and she had the dignity to recognize it without prolonged performance of displeasure. She said to Cecily, one morning in the corridor, "You are perhaps less manageable than I preferred," which was the closest her register could come to a concession, and Cecily received it as such, and said nothing unkind in return. Dorothea Vane had returned to London and her mother's house, and to a season in which she was, in every respect that the season measured, still an excellent prospect. Eliza was not going to Bath. She was told this directly in the east drawing-room by her guardian, while Cecily sat in the chair beside her. Eliza pressed her fingertips together, and then released them, and said, "Will you be here as well, Miss Hartwell?" And Cecily said, "I will, though my name will change." Eliza thought about this for a moment. "Will I call you something different?" "You may call me whatever you prefer," Cecily said. Eliza considered. "I will think about it," she said, which was, for her, a gesture of considerable warmth. The first frost came the night of the 28th of September. Cecily stood at the window of what was now her sitting room, looking out at the lawn, where the grass was beginning to carry the morning's cold, the blades catching the first light with a particular silver clarity that was nothing like summer. The park stretched away to the ha-ha and the fields beyond, and in the fields the harvested ground lay open and dark and still. Behind her, the fire was well made. She could hear it breathing in the grate, the small specific comfort of a fire in a room that belongs to one, the kind of thing that cannot be understood from outside it. The oval miniature of her parents was on the mantelpiece, propped against the clock, where she could see it from the window. She had not put it in her pocket that morning for the first time in 4 months. She had not needed to carry it. She thought of June, and the crossroads, and the particular quality of being dismissed by someone who has not looked at you carefully enough to know what they are dismissing. She thought of 4 miles down the wrong road, and a bridge that was out, and the confirmation, available to anyone who had turned back and taken the right road, that the woman at the crossroads had been correct all along. She had been correct all along. Not only about the road. He had said so, publicly, in a room full of people whose opinion had mattered very much to the machinery of the world she occupied. And the machinery had turned, as machinery eventually does when someone of sufficient authority applies the weight of an accurate observation to it. The frost lay on the lawn. The fire breathed behind her. In the study down the corridor, the portrait of a young man with an open expression looked out at a room it had been turned away from for 4 years and faced the morning. She was home. If Cecily's story has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments and take a moment to subscribe. Every story here is told with the same care, and the next one is already waiting.